Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our webinar recording entitled The Overview of the Apprenticeship Reforms. This is with Twigg and Bryony Kingsland.
Good afternoon ladies and gentlemen, or good morning. Welcome to this City and Guilds webinar. Today we're going to cover the following contents. We're going to have a brief look at the apprenticeship reforms. We're going to look at transition planning as organisations moving from the old to the new apprenticeships. Bryony is going to give us an insight to the funding changes, and we're also going to look at planning and delivery, points for you to consider to make a successful transition. And then ultimately we'll look at next steps. So, to start with the apprenticeship reforms. Fundamentally what has happened is employers have been given the driving seat to develop the type of apprenticeships they want for their future employees. In undertaking this role, employers have been put together into trailblazer or employer groups to become the champions for particular occupations. To enable them to become that champion for that occupation, what has happened is that they have to make application to the government, and once they've been recognised, they become champions for that particular occupation for the foreseeable future. During this role, employers have the ability to design apprenticeships to increase the flexibility of the actual delivery of the apprenticeship. And in considering that, many new concepts are being put forward which would have been foreign to the old apprenticeships. So, in increasing the flexibility delivery, some organisations and some companies and businesses have decided that qualifications no longer play a role in apprenticeships. And many other attributes have been embedded into apprenticeships to increase that flexibility. The government have introduced a new tax to simplify the funding, which we'll look at shortly, but basically what has happened is that a new pot of money has been generated through a levy which is paid by employers over a certain size, and also that the organisations that are under the minimum size of levy payment have to provide a minimum of 10% contribution. However, there are some circumstances, depending upon the type of apprenticeship and the actual very smallest companies, who may not have to actually pay that contribution. And then overall, the effectiveness of training is probably being driven by employers having a bigger role in selecting and being able to negotiate the price of apprenticeships. So going forward, you can well expect that though there is a funding cap for the value of an apprenticeship, that an employer may wish to look for more effective and economic solutions to deliver apprenticeships. So just look at planning your transition. Here's a few things that we need to consider. If you're not already into the change of apprenticeships in your business, then I would suggest that you need to start to look at it as a matter of urgency. The research that we have currently undertaken with customers has told us there is a high level of concern about the readiness to deliver apprenticeships. We may be delivering the same occupations, but the detail of delivery may be somewhat different than the traditional apprenticeships that you have undertaken. We need to be assured that the plans are well on track, and it may help us to be able to help you to provide action plans to move forward as a business so that you can deliver these new apprenticeships. So in principle, no matter what stage you are at in delivering these new apprenticeships, City and Guilds is there for you, and we will be happy to help and assist. There are several decisions you need to make. Because your current business is probably driven by SASE frameworks, and those SASE frameworks have been under enormous pressure with the reduction in funding to deliver those. You may have to consider about how you deliver your current apprenticeship frameworks. It may drive you to move to new apprenticeships where the funding is far more lucrative, or you may be in a situation where there is not a new standard currently available, and you may have to consider more effective ways to deliver those apprenticeships. Or ultimately, can you afford to do those apprenticeships going forward? There is also the intermediary ground, where you know that a standard is coming, you want to keep your customer base, but you know that the economic viability of those apprenticeships are stressful on the business, but you don't want to give up that link with those customers, so you keep the old apprenticeship and take a burden and switch to the new apprenticeship standard as quickly as possible, where it becomes a much more viable and acceptable proposition. So, moving forward, you might want to also understand the difference in apprenticeships. Once again, I must emphasise, if you're training a vehicle mechanic, it is still a vehicle mechanic you're training and developing. However, some of the mainstays in apprenticeships have considerably changed. The key concept of having an on-programme element or a development period for the apprentice, and at the end being able to sign the apprentice off, hasn't really changed. However, the way you get there in the current SASE apprenticeship, having continuous assessment, is no longer valid. What you will need to do, though, is to be able to do formative assessment of progress while on programme in the new apprenticeships. Qualifications, which have been a mainstay, MVQs and technical certificates, are no longer necessary in all apprenticeships. Matter of fact, in the new apprenticeship standards, the majority of apprenticeships do not actually require qualifications. This, in some instances, may see as a point of giving you freedom to develop much more focused programs for employers, or in another way, it may actually be quite a scary situation of having to deal with the apprenticeships with no scaffolding, which you used to consider the qualification to provide in the apprenticeship. The English and Maths has more or less followed through, and is one of the only real elements that's followed through exactly as it is in the SAFE frameworks into the new standards. Elements of personal learning thinking skills and employment rights and responsibilities, though they have been an important aspect in apprenticeships in the past, are no longer regulatory requirements in the new apprenticeship standards. So, going forward though, the introduction of behaviours and behaviours that have been designed to underpin the occupation are now needed to be developed and assessed in the new apprenticeship system. There is another element that's been added to the new apprenticeship system, which is to be able to go through a gateway, which is the link between the completion of on-programme development of the apprenticeship and the final endpoint assessment that is going to be done independently of your organisation of the capability of that apprenticeship. The gateway is important for two aspects. It's a role that employers in the past haven't had a significant part in, but going forward they do have the right for veto if they feel their apprentice isn't ready. In balance to that, the provider is also a major contributor in in signing off the apprentice through the gateway. So what we need is a joint agreement that that apprentice is really ready for endpoint assessment. And lastly, let's not forget about the apprentice to learner. It is important that this aspect is taken most seriously. To go through that gateway and then to be exposed to an external body to check their capability is quite a daunting prospect for any learner. So we need to make sure that all three parties are happy to go through the gateway to endpoint assessment. As far as endpoint assessment is concerned, that is a purchase that you will make from a third body organisation that is on the endpoint assessment register that the ESFA hold. Also, going forward, a change is that the completion certificate will be applied for by the endpoint assessment organisation. The information to be able to make that application will come from the provider and the employer so that the application can be successful. Once we have had a successful completion, the ESFA will send that apprenticeship certificate directly to the employer for awarding and distribution to the apprentice in that organisation. So, what we have also offer, and you can look deeper into many aspects of this presentation, is we provide a free online booklet that you can either read electronically or print off, and is a very useful guide for both an employer's perspective to apprenticeships as well as the providers. So I'd like to now hand over to my colleague Bryony, who will now look at the funding changes.
Hello everybody. So as Bill said, the government has introduced an apprenticeship levy, and they introduced it on the 5th of April this year. And that levy applies to all employers that have a payroll above £3 million per year. Any employer with a payroll above £3 million will be paying that apprenticeship levy at 0.5% of their monthly payroll. They pay it on a monthly basis. It goes into HMRC, and then the government allocates a certain percentage of that money into an apprenticeship account for employers to use to fund their apprenticeships when they're working either as an employer provider, i.e. they're delivering apprenticeships to their own staff, or when they're working with a provider to deliver those apprenticeships on their behalf. The reason I say a percentage of the levy only goes into the apprenticeship account is because the levy is collected across the whole of the UK, but it's actually only in England the levy is used. Therefore, the government takes a percentage, and that's the percentage of your employees that are based in England, and that's the amount of levy you'll get. The other funding given to the devolved nations, that's Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, and they use their funding to fund apprenticeships in a completely different way. So in England, it's only for English employees that you can use your levy, or employees with a postcode in England, and that's the proportion of funding you get. So basically, once you've got that funding and you decide you're going to work with, say, a provider to deliver your apprenticeships, you start an apprentice and that you negotiate a certain amount of money for the cost of that apprenticeship with your provider. Once you have both agreed what that apprenticeship is and what the negotiated price is, you will input information to your apprenticeship account, and the provider inputs information to their own data system, which is called the ILR system, that they return data on the qualifications they're delivering, the Educational Skills Funding Agency, the ESFA. What then happens is that those two pieces of information link up in a background system, and once that information is correct on the provider ILR system and also correct on the employer apprenticeship system, the government releases the funding to the provider to enable them to deliver that apprenticeship. But what happens is the government holds back 20% of the cost of that apprenticeship as a completion payment. So as you can see on the slide that will be showing at the moment, if the lifespan of the apprenticeship was 24 months, the provider gets 80% of the negotiated price of the apprenticeship split into equal 24 monthly payments across the lifespan of that apprenticeship, with 20% held back for when your apprentice completes. So the provider can only claim that 20% once the endpoint assessment has taken place. So out of that money, that's the 24 months that the provider gets, and also the 20% on completion, the provider has to pay the endpoint assessment company, they have to pay for any on-programme costs, and any other organisations that might be supporting them in the delivery of that apprenticeship, for instance, if they are using subcontractors. The 20% completion payment is not to pay for EPA, it is a completion payment. So it's only paid when the apprentice takes the endpoint assessment, and it's paid whether the apprentice fails or passes that endpoint assessment. So even if your apprentice fails, the provider can still claim that completion payment. Therefore, when providers and employers are negotiating the final cost of the apprenticeship, it's very important to take into account within that overall cost of the apprenticeship the fact that your apprenticeship, your employee's apprenticeship, might need to do a resit of their endpoint assessment. So that needs to be taken into account for the full cost. The retake of an endpoint assessment in apprenticeship can only be paid for if the apprentice does extra learning. If it's just a resit, then the employer has to pay for the cost of that resit on the apprenticeship. And the way that the provider claims that completion payment is the date they put into their ILR data return, and then that triggers payment from the ESFA for that completion payment. But it may take up to 30 days for that money to come through. And just to be very clear, providers have to keep a full financial transaction audit trail of all the payments. So they have to input to their ILR both the full negotiated cost of the apprenticeship and the full negotiated cost of the endpoint assessment. And they have to keep invoices from both the employer and also from the endpoint assessment company and keep them as an audit trail for audit by the Education and Skills Funding Agency. So let's have a look at a bit of a standard example and any issues that might occur out of that. The Head Professional Standard at level 3 sits in the £9,000 funding band or funding cap. So if a provider was negotiating with an employer and they agreed the final price of the apprenticeship to be £8,250, including the cost of resits, if you deduct 20% completion payment from that, that means across the 24 months that that apprenticeship takes place, the provider would get £6,600. That's £275 paid each calendar month when they return that ILR data returns. And then on completion, when the endpoint assessment has taken place, the provider would earn the final 20% of £1,650. As you can see there, the £8,250 pays for any subcontracting delivery, the on-programme assessment, the 20% off-the-job training, the endpoint assessment, and also any resits. So things that providers and the endpoint assessment organisations are still thinking of is that the ESFA and DFE want to drive a commercial market. So it's going to be quite a tough transition for both providers and employers to move to that place where they are negotiating effectively to make sure that the employer gets what they want from the point of view of economics and cost effectiveness for the delivery of their apprenticeships, but also that the provider has enough money to deliver that apprenticeship in a way that meets the quality standards that will be needed for the endpoint assessment, but also a level of quality that meets the employer needs and the learner needs, because we need to remember the learner is in this as well. They're the third party in this, and they want to get good learning so that they can actually provide the skills in that sector on occupation going forward for both the employer that they're working for now and any employers they might work for in the future. A lot of employers are not in the habit of negotiating with providers over the cost of apprenticeships. So it's much better for providers potentially to have a pricing structure in place that supports them. They know how little or how much they can do an apprenticeship delivery for. Obviously, providers will try and drive down the cost of endpoint assessment, but again, it's very important here to take into consideration the quality of endpoint assessment and what your endpoint assessment organisation needs to do. For example, they may need to organise premises, they may be recruiting an assessor who only works sporadically in the assessment area, is actually quite expensive themselves on an hourly rate or a daily rate. So making sure that if you do drive down the cost of EPA, it doesn't drive down the quality as well will be an important aspect of your negotiation. So let's have a look at the real cost of an apprenticeship. So for that $8,250, the provider and employer have actually negotiated the cost of that professional hair apprenticeship at level 3. The full cost of the apprenticeship is the $8,250 for the on-programme, the $1,650 for delivery of the EPA. If your materials for on-programme cost approximately £200, and then you've got external quality assurance of the endpoint assessment, which also has to take place. But there are also hidden costs in that for the provider that everybody needs to consider. Both the employer and the provider and the endpoint assessment organisation needs to consider what the hidden costs are. And that's information, that's items such as on-programme assessment, off-the-job training for the learner, staff time and travel, any staff CPD to make sure that what they're delivering is completely up to date for the occupation, any initial assessment that takes place and the inductions for the learner into their actual programme, the initial negotiations and the time and legal costs for that, any capital expenses, the quality assurance of that delivery, and then for the provider or the employer provider, if they're delivering their own apprenticeships, to also have the ILR management and their data returns that they have to make on a monthly basis to the Education and Skills Funding Agency. So even though you might be thinking about the full cost of an apprenticeship, it's also worth taking into consideration those hidden costs that fall either to the employer provider if they're delivering to their own staff, or to the provider if they're delivering on behalf of the employer.
Thank you, Bryony. What I'd like to do now is just to move on to planning your delivery and points to consider. I like to think of this slide, the sort of banana skins that are in the system that you can slip on. So what I'd like to do is just to highlight some of these points, which may be obvious but can easily be missed. So when you're moving from your current SASE apprenticeship to the new apprenticeship, what is the apprenticeship you're moving to? I have actually negotiated with several providers in recent times, and they heavily relied on what they've done in the past and not invested in what they need to be doing in the future. A wise purchaser knows what it wants, not what is going to be given or offered. So I suggest that's something that you consider seriously. We also need to know how to register your learners. We've had copious numbers of inquiries of how to learn the actual ILR system and how to register it, and how's that different to registering before. So we've had an awful lot of queries over recent times, and I think that though we can help you, clearly the ESFA is clearly your clearest point of call to be able to make sure you're doing the right thing at the right time.
The ESFA have just published ILR guidance specifically for the 17-18 delivery, and in that there are some very new guidelines about how to make sure that you are completing your apprenticeship data returns and the information on the financials that you're agreeing with your employers. And the information is all in there in that guidance. So do go onto the .gov server and look for the 17-18 ILR guidance. It's very comprehensive.
Thank you, Bryony. We also need to look at timelines. There is, though we have timely completions, remember timely completions isn't about successful completions. Timely completions is the type of data and information you put into the system when you will complete that process and where you'll be actually undertaking endpoint assessment. So it's also something to really consider. What support materials you'll need, and and are you going to be able to buy on-program delivery materials off the shelf, particularly where qualifications are no longer relevant? Will you offer qualifications to employers because they still want to pay the extra money and have their actual employees qualified in a more traditional way? So there are all sorts of things and materials, or even down to the City and Guilds are offering accreditation of your materials if you want to use them directly on the apprenticeship program. So there's all sorts of things to consider in as far as support materials in delivering that apprenticeship. We also need to consider about the staff, what your staff currently do and what they need to do in the future. Remember, they have lived in a world of continuous assessment for many years, for 15 or so years, driven by a system of NVQs. Going forward, the role may have a significant change, and mentoring becomes a much more key element in supporting the apprenticeship on program, together with supporting their learning needs as they go along. We also need to consider what the endpoint assessment is going to look like. There are certain skills in endpoint assessment that they may not actually be developing in their actual occupational role. Many of the endpoint assessments ask for professional reviews, apprentices to stand in front of panels and to go under a grilling type process to demonstrate their capability in their particular occupation. That is a skill in its own right and may need developing. And here at City and Guilds, we're already considering support materials to look at the actual skill set required to be successful at endpoint assessment, which is in addition to the skills required to be capable in the occupation. We also need to think about how we're going to have a relationship, an interface with the endpoint assessment organisation. It isn't just a one-street scenario. When endpoint assessment kicks into place, there may be considerations about it may have to be an employer's premises. That will be the onus of you as a provider to ensure that that situation is available. Or in other circumstances, it may be that we need resources or venues to be able to undertake endpoint assessment. Once again, we need to be able to liaise, negotiate, and also support endpoint assessment in partnership with your chosen endpoint assessment organisation. And then lastly but not least, what you need from an endpoint assessment to be efficient, because we at City and Guilds will be doing everything we can to make this the most effective and simple endpoint assessment scenario for both the employer, the provider and the learner. But each of those particular parties will also have a contribution in achieving a successful endpoint assessment activity. So let's just look at next steps. As I said before, City and Guilds is here for the journey, and we are doing many things as a charitable organisation to support the success of both our current and future clients, customers. But we also offer a much more in-depth service going forward based on a consultancy service where if you as an organisation want that extra bit of help and support, we can actually take you a comprehensive process for being able to audit your current apprenticeship strategy, define what your new offer is for the future, and actually develop the type of action plans to move you from A to B, and then actually look at your skills within the business to ensure that you have the future skills to be successful. So those are sorts of things that we in Sitting Guilds can help you. And if you talk to your business managers or talk to the direct sales, you could be instantly connected to our consultancy service to help with those extra bits of information and guidance and support that you may feel you need as a business. We also offer a comprehensive one-stop shop of support materials that are available not just for Sitting Guilds, but also from other supporting organisations. And the following couple of slides will just take you through the connections to the on-site web pages for those particular support services. So, moving on to the last slide, what I'd like to do is to thank you on behalf of myself, Bill Twigg and Bryony, for joining this webinar. We hope it was of some value to you. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.